anyways, we are very excited to take the challenge on, and very excited to hear Ioannis tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tonight, we are delighted to host Dr. Ioannis Grigoriadis, Associate Professor and Jean Monnet Chair of European Studies in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Kent University, and a graduate of Columbia University, where he received his PhD from the School of International and Public Affairs. In the 2016-2017 academic year, he was an Istanbul Policy Center Stiftung Mercator Senior Research Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, and a Stanley J. Seeger Research Fellow at Princeton University. He has written numerous books, including Democratic Transition and the Rising Tide of Majoritarianism, comparing the cases of Greece, and Turkey, which was published last year and which he will be speaking about tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ioannis Grigoriadis.
Good evening, and thank you very much for being here tonight. Let me first start by thanking Columbia University Global Centers for organizing this wonderful event. It's a great coincidence to get to meet the new co-chairs of the Alumni Club. So I will be talking about a project that has sort of stuck in my mind for a couple of years. The first occasion for working on the constitutional reform in Turkey was given some years ago when Sabancı University issued, there is a Sabancı International Research Award that very often sets some interesting research topics. So, because there was already a discussion in Turkey for some years on the constitutional reform, I thought that writing a paper for the Sabancı competition would be something both interesting and meaningful. So that's what I did. I wrote a paper that eventually became more relevant because the debate in Turkey about the constitution became more vibrant. So, and the debate became different as well. So vibrant and different at the same time, because the debate on the constitution in Turkey started in a different manner and ended up producing a completely different constitution. So, coming from Greece and working in Turkey for many years, I always have in my mind the possibility of comparing institutions and political processes in the two countries. Normally, the two countries are not taken as, let's say, common cases for comparison. We consider them to be very different, and it's true that there are big differences between Greece and Turkey in many respects. Yet I think that this book tries to highlight one of the commonalities. And I try to highlight a common debate that has been introduced in both countries over the last decades, which is a debate about the type of democracy we're talking about, what sort of democracy we want to establish in Greece and Turkey in a period that follows an authoritarian or sort of a tutelary regime. And in that respect, the rise of populist majoritarianism, as you see in the book title, I think is a very pertinent concept in both countries. In Greece, we witnessed this mainly in the 1980s, and when there was a big debate on the constitutional reform that takes place back then. In Turkey, this debate is more recent. So it took like in the last 3-4 years, actually. But interestingly, ever since I've completed my manuscript, there has been a new debate in Greece about the constitutional reform, which is, again, stepping on this footsteps. So in a sense, the majoritarian argument is very relevant. So the government, for example, suggests the widespread use of referendums. And the referendum is a very sort of majoritarian instrument in order to resolve political disputes in all countries. So let me start by highlighting the issues that I would like to talk about here today. It is interesting to highlight that majoritarianism and populism are issues that emerge in countries where we consider democracy to have been fully consolidated, or they are the model cases of democratic regime today. So even in the United States today, or even in Great Britain, if we look into the Brexit debate or the election of Donald Trump, we can find very interesting features that we can track and trace in the discussion that we will be having tonight. So what I'm arguing in that respect is that majoritarianism has proven to be the dominance of majoritarianism and the reflection of majoritarianism on the Greek constitution has proven to be rather bad advice because it tends to weaken or corrode check and balance mechanisms in democratic institutions. And this is likely to weaken the quality of democracy and also facilitate a path to crisis. So in a sense, like weaknesses of institutions are likely to mean that crisis will not be dealt with in an efficient way, and the effect of the crisis will be bigger than originally expected. So let me highlight a number of criteria in order to understand what we call majoritarianism. There is a literature on the topic that, of course, I cannot be talking about in detail tonight, but let me give you some important points. We talk about one party per majority cabinets, or we talk about a legislature that is unicameral. What I'm doing on the slide is I'm comparing consensus democracies versus majoritarian democracies. If I can define majoritarian democracy in a very short sentence, I would say that majoritarianism is the democratic regime whereby 51% can impose its full will on the remaining 49%. And this is considered to be both legal and legitimate, because you can say that it's legal, yes, but is it legitimate in the context of a democratic society? While in a consensus democracy, we tend to expect the parties to talk and discuss the issues as long as possible so that common areas of interest and consensus and compromises are achieved. Of course, this takes longer. It may look inefficient to some degree, but on the other hand, the quality of the decisions is meant to be higher, and the consensus within the society is likely to make these decisions be more relevant. So, in that context, we can identify several criteria to understand whether majoritarianism is dominant or not. So, if the constitution is rigid, this is likely to mean that the majoritarian system is weaker, and because consensus is required for changing the constitution. Judicial review of the constitutionality of legislation points towards a consensus-driven system. The more the parties, the more likely that the consensus system is strong. We talk about, of course, plurality versus proportional representation. Plurality electoral systems support majoritarian systems. So this is the one term I'm using. The second term I'm trying to introduce tonight is populism. It's a very, very controversial issue because we use some words very often in our day-to-day speech, but the day-to-day speech of many of these concepts makes them uncertain or blurs their true meaning. So I will try to shed some light on the concept as understood in the literature. There are some very, let's say, extremist approaches towards the term. Some people think that populism is the path through democracy, the rule of the people. Some consider populism to be the path to fascism. So there are people who have this a priori positive or a priori negative approach of populism. I will try to start somewhere in the middle. I don't necessarily consider populism to be a negative thing, because we do need the people through democracy, so we cannot run a country only by their elites. So finding a way to involve the people and the majority population is essential. But this doesn't mean that populism should be the primary sort of criterion of political orientation and self-identification in a country. So what populism is doing, for example, is what the American Abraham Lincoln sort of stated in the 19th century. He was a populist of his time as well. So, you know the famous saying, government of the people, by the people, for the people, can be understood as a populist one. But of course, one needs to highlight that understanding the people as the true representative of what we call the general will of the population is something that may lead into illiberal consequences. Why? Because there are the minorities, and the minorities may be delegitimized by the majority in a populist context. So if the people is represented by the majority, this means that the minority is not part of the people. So they don't represent a legitimate counterpartner, and their rights are sort of threatened in that environment. So that's what most populists do. And as Mother and Kaltwasser have identified, populism is an ideology that considers society ultimately separated between the people and the elites. So the many that are underrepresented or sort of suppressed, and the few who are those who control the means of production, the educated, that run the country, whose sort of government, though, is not legitimate. And normally there is a normative attitude towards that, because the people is understood to be as pure and true, while the elites are meant to be corrupt. So populism claims to restore the rule of the many in a context of the political struggle. So in that respect, populist leaders come to power, and Donald Trump is a very good example in that respect, by representing the interests or the voices of the sort of underdogs of any society. So they are claiming that I will give voice to the people who cannot participate in American politics. So they have been marginalized, they have been put aside. Of course, what is interesting is that the criticism against the elites should have receded when they come to power. But in that case, populist leaders normally claim that they may be in government but not in power. So the terms of the populist debate is changing. So they argue that I came to power, but the state is not under my control. So because the bureaucracy is still part of the elites, so it's controlled by the elites. So the populist struggle continues for some years or many years, depending on the abilities of the leaders to pursue that. So this, of course, environment is likely to suppress a liberal expression, because minority voices or sort of are not likely to be accepted or tolerated. And we very often see attempts to hijack the state apparatus. So the populist leaders try to establish their own control and their own clientele within the respective bureaucracies. So this is the general sort of understanding. What I'm trying to highlight in my book is that because populism is normally thin conceptually, it can coincide with left-wing or right-wing symbolic resources in establishing a political message, which means that you can have left-wing versions of populism and right-wing versions of populism. So one of the main arguments I'm making in the book is that Greece is more of a sort of left-wing populist system, while Turkey is more right-wing populism. And how we define that? We define this referring to ideologies like nationalism, socialism, and conservatism. Every party tries to establish a combination of the two which is different. However, there are some common threads that we can identify in order to be certain that this is a populist phenomenon. Actually, the example of the coalition government in Greece is, I think, is a very telling one, because we have two parties that are supposedly completely different in terms of their ideology, but what brings them together is populist and nationalist sort of attitude towards Greece and the world. So while this proves to be a much deeper and much more meaningful line of alignment between the two. So, if we come into the constitutional debates, of course, populist governments try to change the constitution. The constitution is the text that defines in the most important, most significant way the political character of any democracy. So, in Turkey and Greece, there have been attempts by these parties to introduce majoritarian versions of democracy. These majoritarian versions of democracy would highlight the weakening of the check and balance mechanism within states. So power would be concentrated in the hands of the executive. In the Greek case, it was the prime minister. In the Turkish case, it is the president, as you know. And at the same time, what is also very interesting is that these constitutional reforms aim to highlight the government party as the sole representative of the nation and the people, while delegitimizing their political opponents as a result of that. And at the same time, this would result in a disrespect or lack of respect for social pluralism. So the idea of different views is not welcome as a sort of element of strength, but as something that is weakening the national unity and sort of really undermining the prospects of the country. So, might move into, I've talked about this issue. So if I go over the Greek case in the beginning, and then I can move to the Turkish case, I'll try to be concise so that we have time for discussion as well. The situation, the constitution of the Greek constitution has been rewritten following the military regime of 1967-1974, and this constitution introduced a parliamentary system, which, however, gave significant powers to the president of the republic. So Greece had a president, but the president wasn't completely ornamental, completely ceremonial. He had some real powers to intervene when there was a political crisis in the country. So it represented a significant check and balance function within the Greek system. Why is populism in Greece relevant in this post-1974 developments in the country? Because Greece remained on the Western camp in the Cold War only after a civil war that deeply divided the country. So there was, during the Greek occupation by the Germans, there were left-wing and right-wing guerrilla groups that sort of were struggling against the Germans. When the Germans withdrew, it was the left-wing groups that were stronger actually on the ground. And then the government that was pro-West needed Western support in order to consolidate its position on the Western camp. So the Greek Civil War left the country destroyed, as if the wars were not enough. The country was destroyed by its own civil war, and of course, civil wars leaves very deep scars and wounds in a society. So throughout the 1950s and 60s, Greece was the state of the right-wing winners. So there was oppression against left-wingers in the country. So this allows for the left to sort of develop a narrative of victimhood, sort of like marginalization, which allowed left-wing parties after 1974 to sort of develop a sort of intellectual hegemony in the country. And because Greece returned to democracy through center and center-right political parties, they appear to say that true democracy has not come to Greece because the left has not been in power. So only when the left comes to power can we say that democracy has been restored in Greece. This was the discourse of PASOK, so the party that Andreas Papandreou established in the 1970s and claimed to represent the oppressed Greek people, and he was the person to engage in this left-wing populism message. So in the sense that, we represent the people and the right-wing elites are sort of hiding behind the constitution that consolidates the position of the president. Actually, when Papandreou came to power, it was 1981, it was Konstantinos Karamanlis, the founder of the Greek politician that was crucial in reintroducing democracy in Greece in 1974. That was the president. So there was an interesting cohabitation between the two most important political figures for 4 years. The cohabitation appeared to be going well, but at some point Papandreou decided not to support the re-election of Karamanlis, because in the Greek constitution it is the parliament that elects the president. So he withdrew his support despite expectations, and he introduced a constitutional amendment which aimed to remove presidential powers and transfer all the powers to the prime minister. And the argument was a majoritarian one, that, like, this is the people, the people votes for parties, the prime minister is elected by the people, is answerable to the people, so this is how Greek democracy should operate. So if you follow the minutes of the Greek parliament back in the mid-80s, there are very interesting arguments about majoritarianism, really, and many of them are relevant to the Turkish case, because you can see the idea that, like, if it is the people that trust the president, and there's this link between the people and the true representative of the will of the people, who is the head of the executive. And on the other hand, there will be people saying that this is very dangerous, this is likely to pave the way to all sorts of unintended consequences in difficult and risky situations. So this is what I'm trying to do in the book. There have been some minor amendments in the Greek constitution in the previous decade. Again, there have been some discussions on reintroducing institutions and majoritarian norms. The most interesting debate, though, was introduced by the current government, which in many ways attempted to reintroduce this populist narrative of PASOK of the early 80s, when they were objecting to the Greek memorandum agreements. So the idea being that it is the elites that join forces with international creditors, but we represent the people, and we will bring democracy, and we will truly negotiate for the Greek national interest. Of course, things didn't work this way when they came to power, but this was the argument. That was the line that convinced the Greek people. So this was the line that continued afterwards. Interestingly, what the current government in Greece is trying to do is, because they've given up on the financial and economic issues, so they've conceded towards the international creditors have done, they've been picking some issues that are not immediately relevant to the international creditors, so that they can forward their left-wing populist agenda. So not in economy-related issues. So, for example, the constitutional debate that raises this discussion, us versus them, us people versus them elites. So they discuss, for example, the introduction of referendums on a great number of different issues, or undermining the role of the parliament through the establishment of some sort of local assemblies that were be let's say, substitute parliaments. All these were interesting and pointed to the same line. The likelihood that this works is very limited, because the government right now doesn't have the majority to put this forward, and they have other priorities at the moment. But I think it's an interesting point of comparison between the debate that took place in the 80s with what has been going on in Greece recently. So, let me talk about Turkey for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we have the time to open the floor for discussion. This is a topic that, of course, you're more familiar with. There is the Constitution of 1982, which prioritized the state over the individual. There is a clear decision that state interests take priority over individual interest in human rights. But even if you look into the the Turkish Bill of Rights, you see that all the human rights are introduced, and there is a paragraph that identifies that rights cannot be exercised against general interest. So there is always a caveat on the human right. Sorry. So there is a general mistrust against civil society and democratic institutions, and the tutelary role of the bureaucracy is institutionalized. So this is the Turkish practice, the Turkish tradition, in a sense. The following military coups, the military withdraws, but only after establishing some guarantees on the institutional structure of the country. So this is the case. There are institutions like the Milli Güvenlik Kurulu, the Yüksek Öğretim Kurulu, the Anayasa Mahkemesi that they reflect this attitude. So it is an elitist constitution. It comes from the opposite. Of course, this constitution came under severe critique when the EU reform started in the country, and I refer also to the pre-AKP era. So from 1999, when Turkey becomes a candidate state for EU membership, there is a strong reform drive in the country. But there are 7 reform packages that highlight the weaknesses of the Turkish legislation and the Turkish constitution. So there are many constitutional amendments, but there is still an argument that the constitution is too authoritarian in its essence, so Turkey needs a new constitution. You cannot repair it beyond a certain point. One needs a new constitutional text. There has been a discussion to introduce a liberal constitution, and I refer to the debate which was about 10 years ago. A committee under Professor Gunos Budun even came to the point of preparing a draft that was sort of meant to highlight the importance of introducing liberal principles in a constitutional text in Turkey. However, this constitutional text was quietly forgotten. So the text was there, but the government decided not to take any action on implementing or introducing it for voting. The last sort of, let's say, stage in that debate was the 2010 referendum that was meant to, again, develop an environment whereby the people against the elites put themselves against each other. The referendum is a crucial majoritarian instrument in that respect. So this was meant to bring the end of the tutelary role of the bureaucracy. However, as we now know, and I have sort of the pictures there, actually this was not the case. So in the absence of check and balance mechanisms that would sort of guide the debate into a completely different direction, the debate about the Turkish constitution shifting from introducing a more liberal constitution to introducing a presidential constitution that practically concentrated the power of the executive in the hands of the president. Normally, when we teach comparative politics, we consider the United States to be an example of presidential system, but this is not the case here. So the Turkish example is more like relevant to Latin American, some old Latin American constitutions. Why? Because there are no check and balance mechanisms. Of course, in the United States, the Congress cannot bring the president down, but the president has to consider the role and the activities of all the other state institutions. Like, to give you an example, follow this Mueller investigation sort of against Trump. This is perfectly possible in the United States. Why? Because the president cannot intervene into the judiciary, as probably Trump would like to, sort of given the conditions. So, but this is not possible. So, what I'm highlighting is that check and balance mechanisms go sort of weaker and weaker in the case of Turkey. So, and in the book I highlight the Gezi events and the sort of the development of this personality cult, which is, of course, not recent to Turkey. So there have been, like before President Erdogan, there have been other figures that have been trying to sort of concentrate power and present themselves as a representative, the father figure of the nation. So it is not so new. So we come to the current constitutional, the recent constitutional debate, whereby the president appears to be not even above party politics, so the president can be sort of a member of a political party. And the prime minister's office is abolished, and the parliament cannot really remove the president, only with the exception of impeachment, which of course has a very sort of complicated procedure for that. So under these circumstances, Turkey went through there was of course the failed coup attempt, the end of the Kurdish peace process, and all this culminated in the referendum, which produced a very sort of weak majority for the constitutional draft that the government introduced. So, as a conclusion, and I would like to bring this open to discussion with you, I try to highlight in the last chapter of the book how the Greek crisis, the Greek economic and social crisis, can also be attributed to the constitutional reform and the effects of this reform on the Greek state and society. So, removing check and balance mechanism is not only a threat for democracy and liberalism, but also weakens the capacity of institutions to address problems. And in a democracy, we expect institutions to deliver wise decisions before crises come to a point whereby an emergency management is necessary. So, undermining the integrity of the institutions increases the chance of social and political crisis. So, unlike in the Greek case, whereby one could have expected a quicker recovery of the economic crisis, we know that the Greek crisis went longer than expected exactly because there was no coalition, no common agreement between the two big political parties. So if you look into the Greek crisis, there are three phases. There is George Papandreou in the beginning, and then New Democracy plays the anti-memorandum card, sort of this populist card. Then New Democracy comes to power, then PASOK evaporates, and then Syriza plays the role of the anti-memorandum and sort of populist line. And then Syriza comes to power, and then there is a high degree of sort of mistrust towards politics that the anti-establishment parties benefit from. Because in the end, people say that everybody's lying to me, so I can vote for the fascist party, sort of like my vote doesn't matter. You know, I don't believe in democracy. So, which is the most threatening conclusion in that respect. So, what I'm trying to highlight, and that would be my concluding statement for tonight, is that building consensus and trust in societies that have been torn for different reasons, I try to highlight the dividing left-right-wing division in Greek society, which is very relevant. Turkey has other dividing lines. You can identify the secular, conservative, or the Turkish, Kurdish lines. So populists tend to feed on these divisions in order to promote their agendas, but this is likely to weaken the chances of states to deliver wise results in economic crisis. So the concluding statement of the book is indeed that building consensus remains an important permissive condition for not only for democratic consolidation in countries like Greece and Turkey, but also for social cohesion and prosperity. So thank you very much. So, you can have questions, yes.
In the U.S. example, we had Trump elected, at least in part, by advocating for the working class. And here in Turkey, Erdogan, another right-wing figure, a conservative figure, has also instituted broad policies for social welfare, whether it's in healthcare or social security. I wonder if you see the right, conservatives, adopting traditional left-wing policies or ideology in the pursuit of populism. And does that perhaps go in the other direction on other issues as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Should we collect questions or answer one? Okay, let's go on to one. Well, the way I think into that, I think the case of Turkey is interesting because one of the biggest mysteries of Turkish politics is why there is no Turkish grassroots strong leftist movement. And one can highlight maybe the effect of the coups, sort of that have shaped, that prevented the rise of a strong labor movement, or sort of a left-wing civil society. And of course it is the demographic breakdown of the country. However, there's a strong conservative majority, which has been, in my view, trapped into the sort of identity politics that the right-wing parties in Turkey, especially the AKP, has been very successfully playing. So in a sense, it is class is not an important, is not a crucial parameter of political orientation in Turkey. It is religious, attitude towards religion that plays the biggest role. So in that perspective, clientelism is extremely important. So one of the reasons Erdogan and the AKP was able to establish themselves in Turkish politics was that they were able in the 1990s to use their position in municipalities to develop these clientelistic structures supporting the marginalized segments of Turkish society in exchange for votes. So I wouldn't be surprised if Trump claims or does something like this. But on the other hand, this wouldn't be really addressing the fundamental concerns of these people. So I would still think that Trump will try to win the vote, even if he runs again in the elections, on the identity dividing line, not on the on the basis that I've delivered economic benefits for you. And I think this is the situation right now in Turkey too. So, because especially in the current situation, the economic position of the poorer segments of Turkish society has deteriorated significantly over the last years. But the government and the government party tries to play the identity card in order for this not to have an effect on the opinion polls. Yes.
I guess looking to the future, what should we expect different with this system after this election? Like, how will it affect? Because a lot of people argue that de facto President Erdogan was managing the country extra legally, as if this new constitution was in place. Would it change anything? Will it make the government manage things differently? And in terms of effectiveness of governance, where should we see potential setbacks with this constitution, with Erdogan or with a different president? How do you think it will make the governance less effective or more effective?
Yeah. I agree on your point. In fact, ever since 2014, Turkey is in de facto ruled by the current the new constitution. So you could see, for example, that the Council of Ministers would meet the presidential palace, not under the Prime Minister. So, but on the other hand, this makes the president fully responsible for whatever is going to happen. So in a sense, it will be a more difficult task for the president to shed responsibility for the future developments. And what I'm trying to highlight here is that the system becomes so personality-centered, charismatic personality-centered, that like advisory mechanisms, or the central bank, for example, like every state has a sort of institutions that are providing long-term advice. Of course, politics are important, so politicians may have their own priorities, but there are certain issues that are more technocratic in nature and not political. So the decline of this technocratic leg of the Turkish bureaucracy is likely to generate more risks, in my view. So it will be a more risky environment. Whether risk becomes a crisis is another issue that depends on a number of other parameters that they are very hard to consider or calculate. Thank you. Yes.
Okay. I think majoritarianism is a kind of flawed and weak version of democracy, which is okay, but it is based on, I think, the assumption that there is this rule of law and all the basics. But when it comes to Turkey, I think that is what is missing. I think in Turkey we have a very serious problem of rule of law, and in which we see the strategic use of law with FETÖ or now that. I have a question mark to label what's going on in Turkey as a kind of type of populist majoritarianism, because which is based on some basics, but we don't have it now. And how we are going to now, from a political science perspective, define what's going on in Turkey.
Yeah. Well, I see your point. What we live now is the so-called state of emergency, which is a whole chapter in political science and political theory. If a country is under sort of like a emergency law, all this discussion becomes a bit sidelined and irrelevant, because there is a sort of a fundamental security threat that the country is trying to address, and this means that human rights, constitutional sort of division of power, all this are sort of put aside for some time, and this might have been more relevant in the immediate aftermath of the coup attempt, but as time passes by, this becomes less and less relevant. So I agree in that respect that the book was designed before the sort of emergency law became a part of our lives in Turkey, and I only hope that we will soon come to the end of the emergency law so that this discussion becomes more relevant. But you are right in saying that the rule of law is a fundamental sort of prior assumption for this discussion. And the examples you gave in the past also show that the Turkish people have reasons to have low belief or sort of low trust in the rule of law, which is a very fundamental problem for any democratic regime. There is an example that comes from Germany. There was a famous case of the sort of person that owned a mill near Potsdam, and there was a case whereby the local prince wanted to sort of confiscate, to buy his property, and this person objected to the prince's sort of pressure and demands, and somebody told him, well, aren't you afraid that something will happen to you? And his answer was, not as long as there are judges in Berlin. So his trust in the German judiciary was as strong as to object to sort of the pressure of the local autocrat. So that's what somebody needs to build, I think. But of course, this takes time. Yes.
Ioannis, thank you very much for being with us today. I wanted to position the question vis-à-vis the European Union. Greece and Turkey clearly have different relations with the European Union and have different statuses vis-à-vis the Union. I wanted to ask you, what role do you think the European Union played in helping, maybe not intentionally, Greece and Turkey, I realize there are two different cases, succumb to majoritarianism? Could there be any instances where the EU could have played a more constructive role in the different case scenarios? And also look at today. What role can the European Union play today, if any? And why or why hasn't it played that kind of role? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I would like to make a point that EU-Turkey, EEC-Greece and EEC-Turkey relations were not as different in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Actually, there were negotiations between EEC and Turkey in the 70s that were interrupted by the Turkish government. And of course, then comes the coup attempt that completely derails Turkey's EU membership perspective. So in the 1970s, Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Turkey were considered to be as countries that were trying to consolidate their democratic regimes. And the argument from the EEC point of view was that membership will support democratic consolidation in this country, and this proved to be the case for the 3 Southern European members. I can even make the point that in the recent crisis, like in 2015, the European anchor proved to be very important for Greece to remain within the sort of the realm of liberal democracy. So I think things were more risky and dangerous than one could have imagined from the outside. So the presence of the European Union is still relevant. Well, in the case of Turkey, the situation, Turkey's EU relations have fallen victims to a number of reasons that are both linked to Turkey and the European Union. And the European Union lost its credibility to Turkish society. The argument that there are double standards against Turkey became stronger. But on the other hand, Turkish democracy also went the wrong way. So in a sense, many of the achievements of Turkey in terms of developing institutions, protecting human rights, finding answers to the big challenges, the big problems that the society is facing, we've had negative developments in that respect. So I do think that the EU will maintain an interest, and there is the accession report, the progress report of the European Commission that highlights at least some of the issues that urgent attention is necessary for Turkish democracy to recover and for EU-Turkey relations to find a new perspective in the near future. So, thanks. Yes, in the back, please. Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Professor. My question is, you talked about the economic crisis and social crisis in Greece. So I would like to ask you if there is a reference in your book about the refugee issue, which it's eminent in Greece and Turkey. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and how it has shaped populism in both countries?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Actually, I'm not making a wide reference to the question of populism, but I agree that it has aggravated existing problems, existing tensions in society. Because if there is declining trust in state institutions and the ability of the state to address its fundamental functions within a society, the arrival of thousands of refugees is likely to derail this state infrastructure and also provide an opportunity to right-wing nationalist and populist parties to find a scapegoat for them. This has been the case in particular in Greece. So in a sense, the whole anti-refugee rhetoric has been reflecting, of course, the general trend in the European Union. So this is not, it didn't start with refugee crisis from the Syrian war or from Afghanistan or from other parts of Asia and Northern Africa. It is older than that, and I think one of the big reasons, and I was referring to the previous question actually, in that linking Turkey's EU membership with immigration was one of the ways to sort of kill the project within the European public opinion. So the perception that hundreds of thousands of Turkish immigrants will appear on the gates of Europe as soon as sort of an agreement is signed between the two parties, provided with a lot of negative pressure. So this meant that right-wing populist parties would carry the anti-Turkey flag, and even center-right politicians like, for example, Sarkozy would move to the right wing, or even far right wing from that, because they identified an opportunity. So in that respect, the refugee crisis has not caused the problems in my view, but has aggravated them and made them more clear to see. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you for the presentation. You said Greece faces with left-wing populism and Turkey faces more with right-wing populism. But, for example, I think 1 week ago or something, in France, 300 intellectuals suggested some changes in Islam religion and Quran. And yesterday, left-wing party, so-called left-wing party, main opposition party in Turkey, condemned these intellectuals, and they call themselves as secular party, and they raised the flag of populism in Turkey. For example, in the previous elections, HDP made many populist discourse. So I guess, in my opinion, and I wonder your opinion as well, populism goes hand in hand with popularity. And in politicized countries like Turkey, Greece, Spain, Italy, UK, in order to become successful in politics, you have to be popular. To be popular, you have to use populism. It's a tool. What do you think? The populism is bad thing to instrumentalize to become successful, or what are the tools or the ways to avoid populism and become successful?
Yeah.
For Greece and Turkey.
Yeah, for any country, in a sense, you require what we call transformational leadership. Leaders that are able to educate their public and sort of introduce concepts, engage with people not from a sort of top-down point of view, but from an equal point of view, and really convince them that it's not the easy way that is going to be the best for them, but the way that is more difficult but more sort of lucrative and meaningful in the long term. But you're right in saying that populism is the easy way out of this, and in many cases the easy way to power. And I think that's why, especially in countries whereby there are dividing lines, and Greece and Turkey are countries where clear divisions exist. We see the case in the United States as well. So there, almost all countries have some sort of dividing lines. So populists are likely to try to capitalize on these dividing lines and develop an argument whereby they are representing the true interest of the people and the many, while those who are in power are representing the interest of a small, illegitimate class. So the answer to that would be, like if you look into the classical literature, like Thucydides has written the history of the Peloponnesian War, and he has a portrait of Pericles, who was the sort of the ideal, so the leader of Athenian democracy. So he has a sort of a list of the attributes and the characteristics of Pericles, which is exactly the opposite of populism. So he was appeared to be the leader to inspire the people and try not come to the level of the people, but is able to raise the people to the point where sort of wise decisions can be made. But of course that's difficult. So it's likely that we have more populists than transformational leaders around. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. What's your prediction about the future of populism in Greece and Turkey? You think it's here to stay or it will go away, and why?
Well, it's difficult to make predictions in countries like Greece and Turkey. I would say that populism is likely to recede through crisis. So in a sense, people tend to learn the hard way. But I don't think it will be easy to eliminate populism. So populism may reappear again in a different context, but of course the international, global conditions are likely to play a big role in that. So as the political agenda is changing from decade to decade, new issues will emerge, and populism will be trying to give, let's say, the easy answers to these difficult questions. Yes, please.
So thank you for coming. I want to ask you what you think about the connection between the globalization and the populism. Could you say that the populism is the backlash of the globalization process?
Yep. Well, to the extent that, of course, it's a very long discussion to highlight what globalization is and does, but in my view, globalization creates winners and losers in every country, in every society. So there are those of us who have the skills or have the ability to win from globalization, so we are more mobile, we work, invest abroad. We have the language skills or the sort of entrepreneurial skills to become winners of that. And they're the people who actually don't have the skills, and they're getting into a precarious position. So because they may become unemployed because their company is moving to China or they're moving to Eastern Europe. So populism is likely to target on the people who are the victims of globalization, and they will try, of course, to develop an argument whereby Trump has been doing this, and said, I'm going to defend the American manufacturing sector by raising tariff walls. Of course, it's not as easy, but it's easy for him to get elected. He's able to offer an easy answer to a difficult question. Normally, answers are very difficult and very complex. But populism has this tendency to provide victims, the victims we know, the culprits are easy to identify, so they're sort of, and easy answers that, of course, are never the full story. It's only part of the story. Thank you. Please.
How do you evaluate the case in Tunisia? So, even though it's not similar as case, polarization and populist majoritarianism is not seems to be less evident. So, is there a possibility for democratic transition?
Well, Tunisia is the country. Yes, it's hard to predict. As I said, I try to avoid predictions. But Tunisia is the only country that maintains the optimism that the Arab Spring, that eventually were renamed as Arab uprisings, has kept. I mean, it's the only reason that we can remain optimistic about this country. So, of course, Tunisia is a country relatively compact in size. It's a country which has a secularist experience. It is a country which is close to Europe, not only in sort of geographic, but also in political terms. So we can be slightly optimistic, but it will be more on these issues that I think the democratization experience will be divided. So in a sense, the ability of the different segments of the Tunisian society to agree on a consensus. We may be different, but we agree that this country is for all of us, and everybody should be respecting each other and their fundamental rights. Of course, this is not easy, and politicians and, let's say, populist groups, or sort of, let's say, in Tunisia, of course, there is the jihadist there's the Islamic fundamentalist sort of threat as well. They have to develop trenches, like bulwarks, against these potential threats that may come out. Yes, please.
Thank you. I would like to ask two questions, actually. The first one is about the 85 amendment that you talked about, the restriction of president powers. How actually does it contribute to the majoritarianism? Because normally president of republic in a parliamentary system is normally considered as a less accountable power to the people and to parliament, and secondly it is normally it is also a political power, not a judicial institution like a constitutional court or something else. So it still has a power regarding the majority, but it's less accountable to it. So I don't really see the connection. The second question is, why did you classify Turkish constitutional court as an anti-democratic checks and balance system? Because normally constitutional courts are considered to be a cornerstone of a consensus-based liberal democracy. So, what was the reason?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, my main point, maybe I was wrong. Maybe one was. I meant separation of powers, really, not sort of the majority. When we talk about the inability of the American president to intervene into the judiciary, I didn't highlight this as an example of majoritarian government, but as an example that the separation of power works, and there are no informal ways for the president to intervene into the operation of the other parts, the other components of the American state. So in a sense, although the United States is presidential, there is a strong president. The president is not as strong as to do whatever he or she wants in the American state. So many unpleasant developments. The American state can organize an investigation against President Trump that may lead to his impeachment without the president having the power to stop this. That's what I wanted to make, to stress. Regarding your second question, maybe I was not clear in my presentation. I referred to, of course, the Constitutional Court is a democratic check and balance mechanism. It's just that the activities of the decision of the Turkish judiciary in the 1980s and 90s have very often allowed people to think that they are protecting the tutelary character of the republic. So they were not really interested in prioritizing human rights and the interests of the people, as I described that in the 1982 Constitution. So their emphasis was more on sort of protecting the essential features of the Turkish Republic as understood by those who wrote the Constitution. Hence the extremely high number of closures of political parties, or decisions, for example, for minority rights, whereby the Armenian or the Greek minority, for example, pious foundations were abolished, and then the Constitutional Court did not protect the minority rights in the country. So that was the point. But you're right, and in principle, of course, the Constitutional Court in any established democracy is a fundamental check and balance mechanism against the executive. So, yes, please.
About this rise of majoritarianism both in Greece and Turkey, what would you say is the situation right now for both Greek minority in Turkey and Turkish minority in Greece? Even now, more than the relationship between Greece and Turkey, it's not the best it has ever been. What would you say is their situation regarding what their governments can do against them?
Well, the topic is Greek and Turkish minority rights is not a part of the focus of the book, but I can answer on the basis of what my experience is. Things have become better in recent years. And interestingly, the state of the non-Muslim minorities in Turkey has not deteriorated in the last years, unlike the state of other minorities in the country. And that's an interesting question, why is this the case? So there haven't been any negative steps. There have been some steps, not all the expected steps, but there hasn't been a negative sort of trend. Similar is the case in Greece. There have been some steps towards recognition of the right of Turkish foundations to call the word Turkish on their name. That was a big issue in Greece for decades. A law that used to deny Greek citizenship from minority members that were emigrating from Greece has also been removed. However, what I think that's a very important issue, which is still unfortunately affecting the public discourse on both countries, is the principle of reciprocity in minority rights. So in a sense, neither in Greece nor in Turkey one considers minority rights as a constitutional right, that these people are citizens of this country, no matter what their language or religion is. So one owes them full rights because they're citizens, not because there's another country that demands their rights. So in that respect, whether Greece observes minority rights in its own minorities should not be a reason for Turkey to do something to the Greek minority here and vice versa. So this is something that we still need to work on, because you see that politicians, whenever there's criticism on that, they will say, yes, but did you see what these people do? So these issues are interconnected in a way which is unfair for the minorities. Yes, please.
Thank you. I understand from your remark on emergency situations that you could write chapters on emergency situations. Not remarking on Greece or Turkey specifically, theoretically speaking, are emergency situations, whether they're real or perceived, more feeding ground for more social populism, creating a sense of threat, whether real or perceived, and a sense of self-pity for the populations. Our country is experiencing a second phase in social populism. First, it was because they were less fortunate, they were born less fortunate. Now there are enemies and threats and terrorism all around, still threatening their own being. Basically, is that more social populism in a sense?
No, I agree that the state of emergency provides opportunities for reinforcing these populist lines, because it is when the people is under attack by the foreign forces or the enemies of the people within the country. So this frame facilitates the communication of a very strong populist message. And the same is, in a sense, the effect of a military operation as well. Like war is also providing this rally around the flag effect that gives the incumbent a very important advantage against the opposition, because the opposition comes in a very difficult position, because criticizing this move, that, like this is instrumentalizing like an issue for domestic political gains, helps the government prove the populist argument. You're not part of the people, you're not interested in the people because the people is at the war, and choose your sides, which is your side in that. So this is very difficult. Yes, please.
Thank you. Populism has arisen as a global phenomenon these days. So when I was listening to your talk, I was wondering whether you could substantiate a bit on the reasons of comparing these two countries. So because some of the explanatory factors kind of are up in the air, at least in my opinion. So would it be perhaps easier to compare or to create some typologies of populisms, also regarding this majoritarian aspect, with regard to democracies, non-democracies, semi-democracies, because at the end, when you compare Greece and Turkey, they don't show the same structural features on many bases, and for instance, Turkey or Serbia for me would make more sense. Or if you could just substantiate the reasons or the explanations of that kind of comparison, that would help. Thank you.
No, I agree that there are many countries that could fall into a group of countries where populism can be explored and established, and this is just the beginning of a work. That is by no means a final project in that respect. But I try to highlight in the case of Greece and Turkey, and of course these are two countries that I know well, so this of course helps me sort of gain a perspective of the political developments in both countries, is how the transition towards democracy, so the end of a military regime in Greece, or exiting a situation whereby the military has real or de facto influence on Turkish politics, facilitates the rise of this type of democracy, which we call majoritarian democracy, which can be tolerated up to a point as a legitimate democratic regime. I'm not saying that the majoritarian democracies are not democracies, but up beyond a certain point, majoritarianism can have so negative effects on the quality of institutions that it's going to undermine the quality of democracy in the medium term. So that is what I try to compare in both countries. And I took the Greek case first because I would argue that Greece had this experience some years before, so it was the 80s that this discussion was made and the constitution was introduced in a sort of purely majoritarian fashion. And my argument was that one of the reasons why Greece failed to address the economic crisis was this majoritarian argument that became dominant. So in a sense, parties from the left and the right could not sit together and establish a common program for the economic recovery of Greece. They would fully object to any reform coming from the government party, which of course would undermine the credibility of the program and undermine the the effectiveness of the program, and this would make their position awful, very difficult when they would come eventually to power, because like a populist critique is a very safe guarantee for somebody to come to power, but it's not a very good way to come to power, because in the end you will disappoint everybody, because you promised everything to everybody and you're not able to deliver, so you put yourself in a difficult position. So in a sense, my book tried to provide some sort of kind warning for the Turkish case, that undermining the quality of state institutions in Turkey through majoritarian practices. So if all powers and everything is decided in the presidential palace, this is likely to bring problems like in 5-10 years. And this is not linked to the current president, it's linked to any president, because institutions are meant to give answers in consolidated democracies and not charismatic leaders with their sort of advisors. Yes, please.
Can one argue if right-wing populism is a bigger threat to democratic principles instead of the left-wing populism? Because when we look at the current examples, there is Syriza Podemos and Bernie Sanders on one hand, and Donald Trump, Farage and Le Pen on one hand. So do you think one of them is a bigger threat to democratic principles?
Well, I'm not sure that we can identify one or the other as a bigger threat. We have examples, for example, Venezuela could be an example of left-wing populism. Like a country which has sort of been suffering, although it's a country very rich in natural resources, it ended up becoming deeply divided, deeply polarized and poor as a result of left-wing populist practices. So you're right that in the Western world, right-wing populism may be more threatening because of the existing economic and social structures in these countries, but I can see cases whereby left-wing populism can be very threatening. And Greece was an example to that, in a sense. If I wouldn't be let me give you an example. There's a statement of the current Greek Prime Minister when he was in opposition, who said that those government officials that implement the austerity measures that the creditors have been sort of demanding are not as Greek as we are. So you see that this sort of discourse in Turkey comes from the right wing normally, right? So people sort of who is the Turk, who defines, somebody has a meter, we can calculate the Turkishness or the Greekness of somebody. So it can be very vicious, but you're right that overall it's right-wing populism that poses a bigger threat right now. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor, indeed, for the presentation. Likewise, I went to SIPA, but my approach will be more economic than political in this level. So how logical would it be to compare Greece and Turkey in terms of rising populism, as despite the similarities in 1950s, two countries, they followed a very divergent economic growth path. While Greece has joined the European Common Market in 1979, Turkey went through in early 80s and followed by in 1990s a very US-influenced economic model. For instance, two countries have very different economic cycles. Even while Turkey had been investment grade in 2013, Greece had defaulted at the same time. I mean, right now it's the downturn for Turkey, now economic expansion for Greece. So I mean, how would, two countries are really divergent and very diverse in my opinion. Difference.
That's true, and I highlighted this from the beginning that Greece and Turkey are not the usual cases to compare. But as I've tried to clarify in my presentation, there are certain features in the political culture of the two countries that I identify as both relevant and comparable. So these, to give you an example, and topic that somebody can explore, this victimhood, or this exceptionalism discourse, that, we are different from everybody else, we are, like, there is this exception, there's in Turkish, this is the Türk'ten başka dostu yoktur, yes? There is a Greek president, actually the president that Papandreou elected in the 80s, who said that Greeks are a brotherless nation. Like, we're alone. So that we are like, we just sail in the world, They have no similarities with, like, Turks, Bulgarians, Italians, Germans. So these are some features that I think are very important because they shape the way we look at the world and we look towards ourselves. And sometimes there are some discourses that, you go to Columbia, to the United States, and you ask people there, and they're very confused. How can you believe this? Are you serious, believing in that? But you need to get out of the context. So I do think that this sort of emphasis towards populist majoritarianism is something that exists in both countries and helps explain why some decisions were made in a way that led to crisis in the economy, as you say. So, despite the existing differences, and you're right, that Turkey is a kind of a country that has had a dynamic economy. It's a big domestic market. So sociologically, sort of demographically, it's quite different from Greece. I could say maybe that the Turkish middle class is closer to the Greek main sort of stream, so that Turkey has it's more diverse as a country, so there are certain parts of Turkish society that are not so different from the mainstream Greek society, but there are certain segments of the Turkish society that are completely sort of different from that respect. So my book is an attempt to highlight some of the issues that help us explain better. So when we compare, we don't need to find two perfectly symmetric cases, and there are not any of them actually. So it would be very hard to find two countries that are perfectly symmetric. So we wouldn't need a laboratory to do that. In social sciences, we just have specific choices, and we have to make these choices within these ones. So I do think that, I hope that the choice of the variables that I make in this book help explain why decisions have been made in Greece in a way that Turkey should be very carefully follow it, so that no same mistakes are made. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ioannis. I had a crisis, so I'm a bit late, but crisis is somewhat resolved. I wanted to thank you very much for being with us today and discussing such pertinent issues. And many of you know, and maybe it was mentioned, that last week, and I know that you're both an alumni, and you were also the recipient of Columbia University, but also you've been the recipient of the International Research Sakıp Sabancı Research Award. Last week in New York, we opened the Turkish Studies Center. Maybe some of you have been following the news, and we're very proud of that as Columbia. It's a project that we've worked on for 3 to 4 years. It will be a Turkish Studies Chair and a Turkish Studies Center. It was welcomed with a lot of passion, and actually we discussed in the panel some of the very issues you mentioned. So thank you so much for that. There will be books for signing. There will be discussion for those of you who want to stay with us. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Small token from Columbia.
Thank you.
Your alma mater.
Yes. Thank you.